Dean Abbott podcast. Today I'm talking to Catherine Jensen, a therapist in the Denver area who goes by Franny Fanny on Twitter. You may know her from there. Thank you for doing this.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Where did Franny Fanny come from?
So my favorite book of all time is Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger.
Uh-huh.
So it's the main character in the book is Franny Glass. And I think I just rhymed Franny Fanny. Mm-hmm. So that's where.
What do you like about that book?
Oh, have you read it?
I have not read it. I know a little about it, but I want to hear why you like it.
I read it first in college. And so maybe that's part of it, like it was a time in my life where, so I resonated with it because she's in college in the movie. So the part I resonated with, so essentially Franny Glass is a college student on the East Coast. She's going to like an elite private school, and she comes back for, I believe it's Christmas vacation, with her boyfriend, Lane, who goes to like an all boys elite private school. And they have lunch in the city, in New York City. And he's talking about, essentially like how he wants to get ahead in life, which professors he wants to get in good with, who he wants to impress. And all of it is about, none of it's like his innate desire to learn for learning's sake. It's all about, how to be admired, how to get ahead in life. So she finds herself like increasingly frustrated during the lunch. And then when she goes home and essentially has a mental breakdown. Well, the other part of it is she's reading The Way of the Pilgrim, which is a book, I forget, I don't even want to describe it because I'll get it wrong, but it's a spiritual book. It's a Christian book. And she essentially has a breakdown and just stays in her room all of vacation praying. Mm-hmm. And so the book is essentially about her spiritual and mental breakdown and about her siblings trying to like help her through that. But I just find it really relevant, I guess, to the culture that we live in, that, can sometimes we can really focus on the wrong things.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's my Franny Fanny.
Speaking of focusing on the wrong things, how has Twitter been for you?
It's been fascinating. Uh-huh. It's been really fun. It's been really frustrating at times. Overall, it's been incredible. I joined Twitter just a few years ago to connect with some people in the psychodynamic therapy world. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm trained psychodynamic as the orientation or psychoanalytic.
Explain what that means for people who are listening. What is that?
Well, it's kind of like old school talk therapy, so before CBT and IFS and EMDR, for all of those, there was just good old psychodynamic therapy. So it's, it has its roots in psychoanalysis, which again was sort of the first, that was therapy before anything else. And so there's psychodynamic theory and there's psychodynamic practice. Psychodynamic theory is like the theory of mind. It's rooted in some pretty basic principles. One being that none of us steer our own ship completely. We have an unconscious, meaning there's motivations, beliefs, feelings underneath the surface that we're not aware of that are often driving our behavior, the way we interact with others. Mm-hmm. It's based in the idea that we're really relational people from the start. From infancy with their caregivers, there's an internal drive to connect, and how what the milieu was growing up with our caregivers and the larger community shapes our psychology. And then we end up repeating those patterns without even knowing it. So that psychodynamic theory is rooted in a lot of beliefs, those being some of the foundational ones. And then psychodynamic or psychoanalytic practice is, the way a therapist is trained to be with a patient in order to help them.
And so you are a therapist and currently going through training in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic approach to therapy.
So when my grad school is primarily psychodynamic. I don't know if it is anymore, but it was. Right. And then my continued supervision and consultation has always been with psychoanalytic practitioners. Mm-hmm. And then currently I'm in a year-long couples therapy training program through the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. So I am currently in that training.
So I'm sorry, I kind of veered you off of Twitter, but you went there to connect with other people who have that interest, yes?
Yeah. So I went there to connect with other people who were posting, because there were some people I knew from my therapy world, Jonathan Shedler being a main one. He has a lot of followers on Twitter now.
Yes.
I knew him from Denver and have gotten consultation from him. So a colleague here told me that he was on Twitter and was basically like handing out free nuggets.
I don't know him, but I have a lot of admiration for him.
He's great.
He seems great.
Yeah, he's great. I mean, he's one of I think what he's doing on Twitter is like kind of a great service to therapists. He's just really handing out these threads of wisdom. So that's been really cool.
I remember asking him on Twitter a while back, how many of his tweets do I need to read before it counts as a master's degree?
Yeah. Yeah, he could hand out CEUs for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so he was a major reason I got on there, was just to read his tweets. And then when I did, I saw that some people I knew from grad school were on there. And so I started interacting with them. And then, so it was mainly for my career. I just went on there to talk to other therapists and read their quotes. And that's been a great community, great community of people where now I have ongoing relationships with some of them and just great professional connections. And then, there's the other sides of Twitter, which I just found fascinating, and disturbing, all the political stuff, all the gender stuff. And so I guess I'm probably kind of addicted. My husband thinks I'm addicted to Twitter.
It's interesting the way that Twitter breaks down into neighborhoods, right? Yeah. So there is a sort of psychodynamic Twitter, and and you can sort of move back and forth over time. Mm-hmm. I've just recently kind of stumbled into baseball Twitter.
Oh, fascinating!
And there is a very active baseball Twitter, mostly made up of guys who are there to tell you what they would do if they were big league players, right? And of course, they're also the guys who probably couldn't run around the block, but
right. Everyone's an expert on Twitter.
Yeah, that's true, right? It's easy to be an expert on Twitter. It's really hard to hit a home run. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that applies to every Twitter neighborhood.
Yeah, totally.
We obviously have a Twitter connection, probably have a bunch of mutuals, I would think too. And you may have noticed that I have sometimes gotten in a little trouble for kind of taking a critique of some of the gender related stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of a critique of the red pill guys.
Mm-hmm.
You see that? Do you see a lot of that kind of? In a way, I hate to even call it red pill, because that was 10 years ago or more.
Okay.
And now that had maybe 20 years ago. I think I started reading what we would call red pill manosphere material almost 20 years ago.
Okay.
And what it was then is totally different now. And now it's that space, it seems to me, is dominated by the most vicious sort of anonymous incel culture that you could imagine. I don't know. Have you seen much of that?
I have. I think, it's another funny Twitter thing. Once you wander into a neighborhood, the algorithm knows you've been in that neighborhood and I think starts feeding you more. So, early on Twitter, I think because I am a therapist and people come in and talk about their lives every day, and of course, that's going to include their relationships. So I have an inherent interest in gender stuff just because I'm a human and a woman, but also it's a part of life that a lot of people find confusing and is complicated. So I kind of wandered into that neighborhood not knowing what it was. And I quickly became fascinated by what was happening.
Well, what was fascinating?
I think the thing that struck me first I guess I'm specifically talking about whatever the 2024 version of Red
Sure.
Pill.
Just for a little context.
Yeah.
I would say 20 years ago, there was what we now think of. Well, there was something for a while called the manosphere. But I would say all of that grew out of blogs that at the time, a lot of them were very much focused on pickup artistry, like how do you get as many girls as possible.
Okay.
What the primary blog almost 20 years ago that was discussing some of these things was written by a pseudonymous author or authors who went under the name Royce. Okay. And it was Chateau Artiste was what it was called. And that blog was brilliantly written. Some of it was a lot of it was about sex dynamics, gender things, but much of it had a political cast as well. And I think out of a lot of that part of the manosphere, we have seen the growth of online of what's typically now called the new right. Mm-hmm. At the same time, kind of splitting off from that for a while was what I think of as the manosphere proper. And the manosphere proper was largely focused on men's issues and men's self-improvement. Kind of took a sense, the approach was that our culture was unfairly oriented toward women's welfare, and men needed to take responsibility for improving themselves and their lives. And so some of it was kind of related, was built around dating, intersex relations, but much of it was also around fitness and career kind of things. And that has now sort of faded and been replaced by what I think is probably incel culture, where it's dominated now by younger men who are just completely cynical about women and about society in general. So they are not like the kind of the original, the older manosphere people who were in fact sort of hopeful because the idea that you could improve yourself out of this bad situation was dominant. And now we have, I think, incel culture, which sort of punishes any hopefulness. And I think that's what you're probably wandered into.
Yes. That's really, thanks for that. Thanks for that context. That makes sense to me because that's what struck me the most about that part of Twitter was the cynicism, the bitterness, and the contempt for women, but also for anyone who views sex relations differently than them. Frankly, there are corners of that world, not everyone, but there are corners that are clearly like so unhealthy And I mean, it's really sad. I feel like some of these accounts are just projecting their hopelessness and hate onto, just putting it out there and onto everyone. So that I was sort of like, whoa, what is this? What is this? Because some of those accounts had so many followers. So it felt like, is this some sort of like cultural wave happening that I didn't know about?
Mm-hmm.
And I still don't know. I'm curious if you have it. I still don't know how much of it is just people who are on the internet all day and how much of it ends up is, I think when you're on Twitter, you can start to maybe have a distorted view of how popular certain things are or not. And so I'm like, are these just a small number of men on Twitter? Or is this like a larger feeling and problem happening in the culture?
Mm-hmm. Well, I suspect both. I couldn't reproduce it off the top of my head, but I know that I have seen statistics and stories recently talking about how younger men and women are dating less, they're having fewer relationships, they stay at home more, etc. And so that there probably is something really happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you are, however, like the world's most cynical incel, incelism, if we can call it that, especially when contrasted with like the older manosphere self-improvement kind of thinking, incelism has a self-limiting factor. So that if you are a man who's really been influenced by the self-improvement kind of thing, you have a drive outward into the world.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a person who's utterly cynical, part of what you're cynical about has to be your own impulse to create. And you've got to be suppressing that in some way.
Sure.
And so there probably is a real reality where if you're these guys, they can't get a girlfriend.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But also it's probably self-limiting at some level too.
Yeah. And that's so interesting that it started with like pickup culture, because that has its own issues, but at least they're out there trying to connect, maybe
right. It's the kind of thing you can outgrow.
Yeah.
And you outgrow it. I would assume that if you're a pickup artist, you can outgrow it because eventually it gets boring.
Sure.
And eventually you have a desire for a lasting relationship.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, I'm going to sit in my basement and hate everything.
Yeah.
Including my desire for a relationship. That becomes like a source of shame for you.
Right. Which you see. I think that's one of the things that is posted about is like, it's to want a relationship is simping,
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of an upside down. It's like everything that's sort of healthy and life-giving, I feel like it's turned around.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
I think you used the word hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
I think one way humans deal with, like, if you take like an incel, so a young man who clearly has either just not had any luck, has had bad luck with women, maybe like continued disappointments. And I'm also guessing there's like a whole history there with a lot of these men of other kinds of disappointments or traumas. And
of course, yeah.
I think one way that we humans deal with disappointment is by rejecting the object of our desire.
Mhm.
So they start off by wanting a relationship with women. They're continually rejected, or they're too shy to put themselves out there. They start to grow cynical. They feel like it's never going to happen for them. I can see that one way to deal with that is to say, well, I don't even want that anyways, and to try and diminish that thing that they want.
Do you have you seen any of this in actual counseling practice where you see either young men or women who are affected in real life by this kind of thinking that's fomenting online?
I haven't seen so much of I have seen a little bit of it. I feel like, I guess what kind of scares me about it is when I've heard it brought up, like with men in my practice, things, it's like they're not in that community. They don't really believe that stuff, but they've heard about it.
Mm-hmm.
They saw an Andrew Tate tweet, or this is just like hypothetical, I'm making it up, but it's like, and then so it's like these ideas out there in the culture, and I can sense sometimes, not just with this, but with lots of things, when you're trying to make sense of something going on for you emotionally, something going on that's difficult or confusing, you want to find an answer. And so you look to the culture. And I do feel like part of what worries me about the incel red pill is, even if it is mostly online and that's not the way most men think, it's like it is out there. And most people maybe get like, they see a tweet, they know of an account, they have a friend who's into it. And I feel like people can grab onto those just searching for answers. So I haven't seen a lot of that, but it does worry me a little, just because I feel like it speaks to potentially something about our culture that is relationally dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm. What could that be?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not really sure.
Well, one thing that occurs to me is that we have a correlation between, like increasing unrestricted misogyny online. Mm-hmm. And I know that people have called everything misogyny. Mm-hmm. From, what a woman who prefers to stay at home, internalized misogyny. It's turned around. But when you literally have hundreds of men on Twitter saying, I hate you, or I hate women, I think it's reasonable to call it misogyny.
Yeah.
It's interesting that at the same time we have this, we also have collapsing testosterone levels.
Right.
And I've noticed that especially when I was a university professor, that even in the 25 years since I had been a college student, the boys were very different, and showed almost no active interest in any of the female students at all. Wow. As opposed to, like when I was in college, there was, as I can recall, there was a higher level of testosterone among all of the boys, all of the college men, who would be at the very least enough to be like, hey, I'm going to go over there and sit in class next to that girl. I'm going to say, what's up? Mm-hmm. But that would be, whatever would drive that behavior seemed to me to be totally missing. And so I wonder if what we're getting into is a cultural situation where biologically men have a lower drive to pursue women, and at the same time culturally are being inculcated into this sort of misogynistic worldview And then one of the reasons that worldview is plausible to them is because they don't have any drive to go out and actually talk to real women.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just thinking about, yeah, that's so fascinating to think about all the different factors or theories that could be at play there. But it does sound like you're really observing something, and I'm observing it too, right? Like it does seem like the younger generation, as you said, like studies are showing, they date less, they hang out with their friends in person less. So something's going on, and that just doesn't bode, it's like, well, so people are connecting less with one another, and people are connecting with the opposite gender less, which means they're going to understand the opposite gender less.
Right. Yes. And I think when I have been the target of these incel attacks, which I have been several times, that is my overwhelming impression, is that these are all men who've never spoken to a woman, or who are bitter because they had bad experience with a woman, and they have no understanding of why the woman he was involved with may have behaved the way she did. And certainly has no sense that he might have played a part in the collapse of whatever relationship he was in. And so I always just think this is bizarre, because these guys who are experts on how bad women are seem never to have spoken to a woman ever.
Right. Right.
But I remember when I was college age or what, I always loved it when my guy friends had a girlfriend, because then she was the one you could ask about how do other girls think, right? Because she's off the table. So now she's like this. And I think that was just a common way of living. Is that you would, as a man, it was not unusual at all to sort of have a female friend who was, for some reason or another, removed from your marketplace, that you could be like, oh, okay, interpret these behaviors for me. That kind of conversation seems to be maybe that kind of conversation is completely missing now.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what you're talking about in ways like just platonic friendship or acquaintanceship with the opposite sex, what happens when that decreases too? And yeah, none of that's good, right? Because I think if you think about like the psychological concept of splitting.
Why don't you tell everyone what that is?
So splitting is, so we all have ways of trying to manage our emotions, and those ways, the internal ways are called defenses. And there's more evolved ones, and there's more primitive ones, meaning like the ones we started using really young, like when we were toddlers. The primitive ones never leave us, but the hope is as we mature and evolve emotionally, we use them less. We don't rely on them. If we rely on them when we're adults, that's really troubling. Like people with personality disorders, for example, one hallmark of those disorders is they rely on very primitive defenses all the time. And so one of those defenses is splitting, which is basically seeing the world through the lens of good and bad, and there's no in between. So rather than people being three-dimensional, that, everyone, me and you and everyone else has good qualities and bad qualities within them. It's like, no, there's good guys and bad guys. And I feel like part of what on Twitter, I see it with the men and the red pill. I think this is also happening on the left. In another way, like white men are getting split off. But I feel like there's a lot of splitting happening in the larger culture. And it's easier to split people you don't have relationships with. So it's harder to, if you're a guy and you don't know many women and you don't interact with women, well, it's really easy to demonize women because you can make them whatever you want in your own imagination. You can project all of these evil qualities onto them. If you start to befriend a woman or date a woman and you start to really enjoy qualities that she has, well, now it's a lot harder to split that whole gender off, you know?
It's so interesting too that these incelish guys that come at me sometimes on Twitter, they are unwilling to hear women explain to them, even from another man, that they can only assume that if this is maybe what you're saying about splitting, that they can only assume that a man who would try to explain something like a woman's point of view or what might motivate women or something like that, they can only assume that he's on team woman and therefore bad.
Right.
I guess the way I've written about the splitting thing is to say these guys conceive of relationships between the sexes as being team man against team woman, and it's a zero-sum game, and who's going to win?
Yeah.
And that team man is this like beleaguered underdog with very little power and resources, and they're up against the longhouse.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's their worldview.
It's fascinating because I'm so well. I guess that's this is going to sound like demeaning, and I really don't mean it to be, but I think that's sort of like a male hysteria.
Yes, it is. That's an important thing to say, that it is at the very least a sort of way of responding to the world that is emotionally unregulated. And that is out of touch with what's real. It's sort of delusional and unregulated.
Yeah.
And again, that makes me wonder if part of what has traditionally, not even traditionally, but conventionally, I guess, kept men from being so delusional and hysterical is a higher level of testosterone. Just that hormonally, higher levels of testosterone tend to lower your experience of negative emotion.
That's I don't know much about what testosterone does, but I'm thinking I've heard before that it's like a motivating hormone, and whether testosterone levels are the cause, that makes me think, yeah, like if you're going, as you said, if you're going out in the world, if you're living life, if you're interacting with women, not just romantically, but just like in the workplace, and if you're relationally healthy at all, you're going to make positive connections. And so you're not going to feel like in psychoanalytic terms, hysteria was, traditionally associated with women who Freud treated, who his conception of hysteria, and then later in the literature, it's like women who really think that men do have all the power. And so there's this powerlessness that drives them, an assumption they're not going to be heard. And so they have to get louder and louder. And they become emotionally dysregulated out of feelings of powerlessness and helplessness. And so it's like when you talk about like the longhouse, and it's like, wow, it's like, so it's happening on the other side now.
Yes, exactly. That's great. It's interesting to me too, as we talk, it occurs to me that so much of this incel kind of worldview, it hates not only women, but in a way it hates other men as well. And so, again, to use baseball as an example, if you're a big league player, especially if you're one who's not anonymous and you have some name recognition or you're a star, your experience with women is not going to be the same as a basement dwelling incel.
Right.
Okay? Because after every game, there's going to be a lot of female fans hanging around. And if you're a single guy, you're going to have a lot of positive interactions with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing for the incel, the question for the incel is, why not just become one of those guys?
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, the baseball metaphor breaks down a little bit because there's 3.5 billion men on Earth, and 200 of them can play professional baseball.
Mm-hmm.
But the principle is that why the question, I guess it goes back to the self-improvement question. Why do you despise men who are in a hierarchy above you rather than trying to climb that hierarchy in some way? Because I guess what the incel misses is that his experience with women, if they have been bad, are bad in part because he traps himself at the bottom of a hierarchy.
Right.
So if the basement dwelling anonymous guy on Twitter, if that's the bottom of the hierarchy, and your big league home run hitter is the top of the hierarchy, they have incredibly different experiences of what even a woman is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the answer for the incel guy would be to climb the hierarchy, but he can't, because not only does he hate women, he also hates every guy up above him in the hierarchy.
Right. That's making me think too, back to this, like, kids aren't hanging out with each other as much anymore. And for whatever reason, we were talking about like the baseball guy. I thought about the movie The Breakfast Club. And, it's like, I don't know if has this changed. I'm 40, so I don't know many like high schoolers, but like, I feel like back in my days, like, yeah, not every guy is going to be the athlete, but then maybe he's going to be the musician, or maybe he's going to be a goth guy, or maybe he's
right.
The hipster who works at the coffee shop. And then there's hipster girls, and there's goth girls, and there's the band girls. And it's like you find, like you can't get into any group because you don't, maybe you suck at sports or whatever. But I feel like there used to be, it's like, well, then you find where you do fit and where you can get some social cachet and where you can find connections. And it's like, are some people just going, rather than doing that in real life, they're going to the internet. And then so rather than finding each other, they become isolated.
Yes, and their hierarchy is fake. It's probably fake, right? Because I'm sure even in incel forums, you have some guys who are the alpha incel and guys who are lower down the hierarchy, because it's just the way things fall out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I suspect, again, if you are caught in a current of social isolation, your experience of just trying to navigate hierarchies and even perceiving, even in my high school, there are multiple hierarchies I could find a place in.
Right.
Even perceiving that fact is probably hard for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So it all compounds, right? Because then someone grows more and more bitter, and then they probably project that out onto their interactions with others, and then they wonder, it's cyclical.
Right. Also on Twitter, we have, and maybe there's an overlap between these people and the incel people, but we have a lot of anti-therapy sentiment on Twitter lately too. Have you noticed that?
I think I've noticed some things. I noticed on your page
Mm,
more than I've
right.
noticed. I think I've noticed a couple interactions you've had. And then, yeah, a little bit I noticed when Abigail Schreier came out with that
Mm,
book, Bad Therapy. So that was
right.
like in the conversation for a couple weeks.
Mhm.
And so I think I saw it then too.
Yes. Did you have a take on that book?
I do. I have to be honest. It's not an informed take because I haven't read the whole thing,
Right.
but I have read a couple excerpts, and you know, that I think she gets a lot wrong. I think she's painting a really broad brush. I think she misunderstands what therapy is, good therapy. I think where I have to give her some grace is that my profession has a huge problem with quality training,
Mhm.
and there are a lot of bad therapists.
Mhm.
It's not all therapists, but it's not a field where I feel confident referring my friends and family to just anyone.
Sure.
And so I feel like that's part of what she maybe was tapping into. I think her conclusions were just way too general.
But there is on the right, certainly, I think a broader sense that therapy is a sham.
Yeah.
And often by people who don't know what therapy is. And maybe part of that is because they have experience, as you said, with therapists who aren't that great.
Mm-hmm.
What you also brought up that they don't know what therapy is. What is therapy?
Well, I think good if you want to see a therapist, you're anxious, you're depressed, something's going on in your life, you're not quite sure how to handle it, your emotions, you're becoming dysregulated, you seek out a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I think good therapy means first and foremost that the therapist is going to, before you even start treatment, the therapist is going to spend time really listening to why you came into his or her door, and they're going to help you articulate what the problem is in relation to something going on inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say like circumstances don't matter or that there aren't external circumstances that impact us greatly, but a therapist's job is to help someone with their psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think good therapy means locating, okay, what is it that's going wrong in here? How are you getting in your own way?
Mm-hmm.
How are you not handling your emotions well? How are you interacting in your relationships that are making people withdraw from you? And so it has to be about something the patient, the therapy patient, can work on with the therapist to change in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's good therapy. And my sense is that some on the right assume it's like all supportive, meaning it's just telling the person, their feelings are valid, and not really doing any of the change stuff.
Any of the change work. It's
Yeah.
interesting. It's funny. I watched this old documentary on Jung,
Oh,
and he had many people he had analyzed were in the documentary. And what they did not say was, I just always came away feeling so supported. Right? They all came away and said, he exposed to me all of these things I had hidden from myself,
wow.
which is a totally different kind of thing. And so perhaps the critics of therapy are correct to say that what much therapy has become is a kind of emotional support for hire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many therapists do that, in fact.
I think that's true. I mean, the training programs aren't great. The quality continues to degrade. And if you graduate, especially like from a 2-year program or something, and you weren't really taught to do this whole change thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do people fall back on? They fall back on like, well, I'm empathic, I can
Right.
support the person, which is sort of understandable, right? But it's like, but if that's all you know how to do, yeah, just sort of, you're not going to see much, you're not going to see your patients really get better.
And I think my impression too is that as you develop a more sophisticated view of what therapy is, that sort of emphasis on empathy and other interpersonal warmth, that becomes less important.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously it plays a part in the sense that you want people to open up to you, but you want people to open up to you so that they will change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's the skills that help change that matter even more than the boy, that must be really difficult for you.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I like the way you said that. I do think empathy and attunement to the patient, really letting them know that you're understanding where they're coming from and their experience, that's a means to an end.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's very helpful oftentimes to get a patient to open up. Not all the time, depending upon the patient's personality. But it's not the end. It's a means to an end. It's an ingredient in the therapy that helps a patient open up more so that we can know what's going wrong.
So I know you need to wrap up, but maybe we could end by just saying if the right reason to seek therapy is because you want to change.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not just because you're upset.
Yes. And oftentimes people are really upset and they might not know what it is that needs to change. And that's okay. A good therapist will help you figure that out. You'll figure it out together.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think there has to be some kernel in the person coming into therapy that really is open to changing something about the way they are or the way they're doing things, which is painful oftentimes. But if that's not there, then
right, it's not therapy if it's not painful.
I think that's probably true. At some point, yeah, it gets pretty painful.
All right. Thank you again for doing this. I'll let you go. I know you need to go change somebody, help somebody change.
Okay, so good to talk with you, Dean. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.